Good evening, everybody, and welcome. If you can't hear me, please put your hand up. You can't hear me, okay? Is that right? Okay. Okay. There's one notice from Megan that the library... Right. Oh, lower them. Okay. Right? Okay. Yeah. Okay, this is a notice from Megan at the library. The library will be holding a paperback sale this Saturday and Sunday during the Handmade in Highgate Fair, which we have. So good quality fiction, non-fiction, art books and children's books will be available. Now, yeah. I'll just wait. Okay. Yes, well, a major theme of our lectures at the moment is rivers. A few weeks ago, you'll remember, we had Colin Thubron talking to us about the Amour River. And tonight, we're delighted to have Giles McDonough speaking about a river closer to Highgate, the Rhine. Giles is a distinguished historian of Germany, but he's also written several books and a lot of journalism about gastronomy and wine. And his first book, which won a Glenfiddich Special Award, was A Palate in Revolution, which was the life of the great early gastronome Grimaud de la Reynière. Giles's books on Germany range from the 18th century to the present day. He's written a fascinating biography of Frederick the Great, but his main field is the 20th century. In 2007, he wrote After the Reich, a groundbreaking study of the Allied occupation of Germany after 1945, which History Today called a superb book written by a sympathetic writer in perfect control of his often dreadful material. And this was followed in 2009 by 1938, Hitler's Gamble, a compelling account of Hitler's annexation of Austria. In the words of the Spectator review, Giles McDonough has repeatedly shown himself to be in the front rank of British scholars of German history. The depth of his human understanding, the judiciousness of his pickings from source material, and the quality of his writing make this a book at once gripping and grave. Just a bit more. Tonight, Giles will talk about the subject of his next book, one which combines in a broad sweep German history, geography and culture, the Rhine. Giles, it's very good to have you here, and we very much look forward to your talk. Okay.
No, you safely going down there.
Is this thing?
No. One more step and another little step, and then just point these up at me again. Everybody hear me? Yes. At the back. Unlike Judy, I have a loud voice anyhow, so I sometimes dispense with these things. The Rhine, which I'm going to talk about today, just to accompany us. There are a few pictures here to distract you from time to time when I get boring. This is a picture of the Rhine in Switzerland, and I've forgotten the name of the village, but we had a nice lunch there, and it's a covered medieval bridge. But you'll see the sense of some of these pictures, I hope, as we go on through the talk. The best view of the Rhine is from the deck of a boat, a barge possibly, if not a cruise ship will do. It is a revelation to wake up on the Rhine, to look out of your cabin window and see Switzerland one day and Germany the next. The narrow channel between Alsace and Baden comes as a particular shock. You could swim it from one bank to the other without much effort. Now, I might find you. That, for example, is Alsace, the river in Alsace. You can't quite see the other side, but it isn't very, very far. And in no way is it an effective border. As the landscape gets flatter, the flood gets broader, and you have to contend with many more vessels that are simply plying their trade, transporting goods locally or shipping them all the way to Dutch Rotterdam. The Rhine rises at Lake Thoma in the Swiss Alps. Some 70 kilometers later, it branches out to become the Vorder- and Hinterrhein, flowing northeast before uniting at Reichenau as the Alpenrhein. From there, the torrent heads north, and after crossing Lake Constance, turns left, running past the German enclave at Büsingen, this will be close to Büsingen, through Swiss and German valleys on the way to Basel. In the course of its 1,223 kilometer trajectory, it forms the border between Liechtenstein and Switzerland, Switzerland and Austria, Switzerland and Germany, Germany and France, and finally Germany and the Low Countries. From Basel, the Rhine turns northeast, and the vines of French Alsace on the left and German Baden on the right. But south of Karlsruhe, the river begins a wholly German sprint that will take it to the Dutch border. South of Worms, you enter Rheinhessen and vines reappear. Then past Mainz, the river turns left again, flowing west past the Rheingau with its south-facing vineyards. Then once again flowing northwest, the river glides past the castles of the robber barons perched on the slate cliffs over the Middle Rhine. On the left is the Lorelei, which lured sailors to their doom. And at the German corner in Koblenz, the Rhine is joined by the Mosel. The land becomes flat by the time you reach Cologne. Now you enter the beer Rhine. Kölsch and Bitburg, bitte ein Bit, you've all seen the advertisement, I'm sure. Real ale production begins at Düsseldorf and the thirsty industrial Ruhr behind. Here the idiom changes too. In Benrath, the local dialect becomes officially Platt. The Ruhr, with its coal mines, is the home of German heavy industry. Arranged along a tributary of that name, just north of Emmerich, you emerge into Holland, and the Rhine becomes the Niederrhein, or Lower Rhine. The Kromme Rhine takes the river to Utrecht. The Lower Rhine's final incarnation is the Lech. As such, it scurries out to sea. In the Middle Ages, the journey time from the Upper Rhine to Rotterdam might have rendered ordinary exports impractical. The Rhine was still not navigable, and sailing vessels were at the mercy of winds and currents. It took Thomas Jefferson 3.5 hours to travel from Mainz to Rüdesheim, a distance of 38 kilometers by road. In the 1840s, steam tugs replaced horse-drawn barges or Mainz rafts. With motorized barges, it accelerated again. Rhenish wine became a commodity in England and Northern Europe in the 16th century. That meant bringing it down from Mainz and passing the tolls and imposts demanded by castle owners on the Middle Rhine, not to mention rocks and rapids. The Rhine and its tributaries were straightened out. Further south, the Rhine only became fully navigable in the middle of the 19th century, largely through the work of Johann Gottfried Tuller, working for the Grand Duke of Baden. Between Basel and Worms, and from 1817 to 1878, the Rhine was shortened from 354 to 273 kilometers, i.e. that stretch of the Rhine. From 2,200 islands, some 2,200 islands were removed. By 1844, 40,000 workers were engaged in inland shipping business. In 1843, times the tonnage went up rather than down. By 1907, it was the reverse. Communication by road was also improved. The first new bridges were thrown across the Rhine at Mainz and Mannheim. As the river got deeper, larger vessels could ply the waters, making the fortunes of Mannheim and Ludwigshafen. Even today, the Rhine is an industrial waterway populated by barges. The Ruhr necessarily added its weight to the trade as Germany industrialized, bringing coal, iron, and steel. Not everyone was pleased. In 1848, Luddites destroyed the barges. In the course of the last 2,000 years, the Rhine has meant access and communications, but it was also the barrier that defended the Roman Empire from fierce German tribes. Once, I put German in inverted commas here because, after all, they weren't really German. They come from rather further east. Once those tribes had crossed it and destroyed the Roman Empire, it watered the modern states of France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. It was the counter that displayed the wealth and culture of the Middle Ages, and a battlefield in a series of quasi-endless, essentially religious wars in the 16th and 17th centuries. Only in the 18th century did it appear to settle down as a backwater, until German culture woke again, and at about the time Goethe was born in Frankfurt, the imperial coronation city on the Rhine's tributary, the Mainz. The future US President Thomas Jefferson fed a myth when he reported the discovery of the final resting place of the Roman general Varus, slaughtered at the Battle of the Teutoburger Forest. Defeat forced the Romans to retreat behind the Rhine. The Cherusci leader Arminius, renamed Hermann, became a potent myth at the time of German unification. His name would be invoked as a German hero during and beyond the First World War. After 1871, Hermann and his Germans were apparently unbeatable. Germany was no longer a papal footstool or a source of French plunder. The Rhinelanders still like to think there was something Roman about them, however, making them superior to the Germans on the far side, a view evidently shared by the British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who awarded Joseph Goebbels a Latin mind. Goebbels was born on the left bank, town of Reit, now part of München-Gladbach. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, and more important, the gradual disappearance of Roman roads, communication followed the lines of the great rivers. People and ideas either took to the water, inasmuch as it was navigable, or adjacent valleys. In the medieval Nibelungenlied, for example, Siegfried's 6th century Rhine journey was only partly waterborne. Thomas Jefferson, travelling on the cusp of the 19th, travelled on the riverbank, but his luggage went by boat. The Rhine's first great encounter with post-Roman civilization was the monastery of St. Gallen, which performed a significant role in the conversion of East Central Europe to Christianity from 750 AD onwards. Notably, 755, the beginning of the evangelization of Bavaria, of course, came out of St. Gallen. The Rhine has been a magnet to many different civilizations. It commemorates the possibly Irish St. Gall, who died at Arbonne on Lake Constance in 646. Irish or English missionaries figured largely in the conversion of Germany from Mainz, the English Boniface of Crediton, Cologne, St. Martin's Abbey, Constance, St. James's Abbey, and Trier, St. Wendelin. The river is home to several different tribes. The Alamans that settled in the upper Rhine were a tribe distinct from other Teutons that filled the space between the Elbe and the Vosges. Dark-haired, blue-eyed, and of middling stature, the Alamans settled in the Austrian Vorarlberg, eastern Switzerland, German Swabia, and French Alsace, driving out their Celtic predecessors. They spoke one of the 4 or 5 languages of the Rhine, Alemannic, a cousin of the German best known today as Swiss German, but Alsatian, Vorarlbergisch, and Schwäbisch are all much the same. Not far from the centre of Basel is the Dreiländereck, the three-country corner, where you may see Switzerland, Germany, and France. But in truth, these are ethnically and culturally identical. In the Middle Ages, they had their own artists and scholars, and even in the early 19th century, a writer and poet like Johann Peter Hebel was making a living by writing in Alemannic. There were no borders for Alamans. Even today, Alsatians tend to shop across the Rhine when they know the price is less. Baden produces wine in much the same style as Alsace. And the famously rank Münster cheese is made on both sides of the Rhine. Alsace is, of course, the best-known non-border of all. France acquired most of it in 1648, but it remained firmly immured in its Alemannic culture, at least until the Abbé Gregoire sought to unify France behind one language and culture during the French Revolution. The real border remained not the Rhine, but the Vosges Mountains. This didn't change much until the Germans clumsily reclaimed the province and made a lot of Alsatians patriotically French for the first time. Some fled beyond the Vosges and opened Alsatian-style brasseries, brew pubs, serving beer and Schukrut, sauerkraut. These were a standard feature of French towns and cities until quite recently. The Rhine's fate was closely linked to the Holy Roman Empire created by the Frankish king Charlemagne in 800 AD. The Franks were one of the barbarian tribes that had extinguished the original Roman Empire. They settled first on the Rhine before conquering most of Gaul. Once converted to Christianity, the Franks stepped into the Roman shoes. Charlemagne decided to adopt the style of his Roman predecessors, as reflected in the artistic flowering at his court in Aachen. He took Frankish civilization across the Rhine and subdued the heathen Saxons. With Charlemagne's grandson, the emperor was split three ways and was to be divided again into a great number of smaller parcels before it was officially wound up in 1806. Mainz is at the core of the Rhine, where it was difficult to navigate south of Speyer before canalization. There were always important and cultural and mercantile exchanges between the left bank cathedral cities of Trier, Cologne, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. Close contact is visible in the exchange of architectural ideas, and I might give you a little view of Speyer there. Particularly in the 11th and 12th centuries, the left bank was the limit of the Roman occupation of northern and central Germany. In Trier, the Basilica and the Porta Negra stand to this day, and Rhineland Romanesque remains close to Roman models for obvious reasons. Charlemagne's chapel in Aachen was modelled on the Church of St. Vitalis in Ravenna. There were abundant Roman buildings standing in Cologne, Trier, and Mainz, which became the templates for the Romanesque cathedrals of Trier, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. The Rhineland added innovations such as trefoil plans and double choirs, and what you're seeing there is one of the choirs of Speyer Cathedral. Each city wanted to do better than the other. So Trier inspired Speyer, for example. Cologne's cathedral was billed to be the biggest in Europe, a reflection of the city's importance, but it remained unfinished. Within the city walls, however, people could attend 250 other churches. In the course of the Middle Ages, the courts of the various tribal kings and emperors bobbed about the Rhine Valley. The Rhineland remained the wealthiest and most sophisticated part of Germany, but its importance began to wane before the end of the period. Of the 7 temporal and ecclesiastical princes who had the right to elect the Holy Roman Emperor, 4 came from the Rhineland, the archbishops of Trier, Mainz, and Cologne, and the Count Palatine. When the Habsburgs became virtually hereditary emperors in 1438, power shifted to the Danube. The religious wars the following century, the division of Germany and Switzerland into Catholic and evangelical principalities and cantons in the 30 Years' War, 100 years later, meant new powers grew up in areas previously considered beyond the pale: Bavaria, Saxony, and above all, Brandenburg. After the Reformation, secular princes gained the upper hand. Worms was famous for Martin Luther's appearance at the Imperial Diet in 1521. This was a thing that we all enjoyed as school children, didn't we? The famous Diet of Worms, which always set us off at the time, I remember. Luther was not only the only Protestant voice raised in the Rhineland. Another brand of Christianity flowed down the Rhine with Zwingli's teaching. Religious wars followed the Reformation in Switzerland, Germany and the Low Countries, until the map of Germany gelled and the religion of the prince decided the religion of the principality. Cuius regio ius religio, forgive my Latin, really bad. The Reformation on the Rhine was followed by counter-Reformation. Some areas remained true to the Reformed religion, others returned to Catholicism. The Palatinate, which became a Protestant territory in the 16th century, then turned Catholic again after the 30 Years' War. Much of the Lower Rhine succumbed to the teachings of John Calvin. When the German star waned on the Rhine in the 16th and 17th century, preeminence in trade and culture passed to Antwerp and the Low Countries. We can have a little cheering view of Antwerp now. There we are. Sorry, not Antwerp, Amsterdam. But Antwerp remained in Spanish hands, and after 1585, all Protestants were obliged to leave. The business hub of the new United Provinces was Amsterdam. From the beginning of the 17th century, Amsterdam became the most prosperous city in Europe, with extensive trading links to Asia and the New World. Religious tolerance meant that the city was relatively open to Catholics as well as Jews. Amsterdam was also benefited from the influx of French Protestants or Huguenots after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Tolerance brought others to the United Provinces, from Basel to Descartes and Locke and Spinoza. Rembrandt represented the artistic flowering of the city, along with the merchant palaces that lined the city's canals. When the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, part of the Lower Rhine went to Prussia, and much of the rest to the Bavarian Wittelsbachs. Cologne and Mainz remained under the sway of their archbishop-electors, and the French seized the opportunity to make off with Alsace. They were reluctant to stop there and continued to press east to seize the Rhineland. Speyer is a small provincial cathedral city which was once the seat of Frankish emperors. If Speyer seems uneventful now, it might be because the city, and parts of the cathedral too, were almost entirely destroyed by the French in the 18th century. I'm just going to take you back to Breisach, which is a village much fought over by the French, and again still bears many scars from the early 18th century. The acquisition of the left bank was a French imperative from the days of Richelieu. On many occasions, they came close to realizing their ambitions, which only really ceased at the end of the Second World War, when Konrad Adenauer made the Rhineland the center of the new West Germany and struck up a close relationship with Charles de Gaulle. Many Rhineland towns and cities, from Breisach to Mainz, still bear deep scars from Louis XIV's time. The French were back again in 1756 and 1792, and in some places retained their hold on the left bank until 1814. Strasbourg is the capital of Alsace, a former German city that became French in 1681 and German again in 1871. In 1918, it returned to France, and in 1940 it was German and remained so until 1944. Its contested status makes it fitting that it should be one of the two seats of the European Parliament. Until the late 18th century, it remained culturally German. It was here that Goethe discovered German Gothic architecture in the work of Erwin von Steinbach. For the Francophile Prussian king Frederick the Great, however, the king was exotic precisely because it was French. Strasbourg was the only French city he ever managed to visit. The Rhineland was stagnant at the time. Many small courts managed to erect splendid palaces when the country at last recovered from the 30 Years' War. The Palatine Elector's Schloss in Mannheim and the Summer Palace at Schwetzingen are cases in point. The French Revolution provided a pretext for the French to seize the Rhine again. During its period as a part of metropolitan France, Mainz was stamped with French customs, and the Rhenish dramatist Karl Zuckmayer, who's played Das fröhliche Weingarten, the merry vineyard, is entirely written in the local dialect, is scattered with Gallicisms, and his Bacchic hero is actually called Jean-Baptiste. Never translated into English, I might add. After the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, Prussia and Austria were awarded roles in maintaining order in the French Revolution and after the French Revolution Napoleonic Wars, and Prussia expanded its holdings to bag the whole northern segment of the river below Mainz, and including the important towns and cities of Bonn, Koblenz, Düsseldorf, and Cologne. The petty rulers and numerous small principalities would be phased out, leaving Germany increasingly tied to Prussia and Austria, with its Bavarian and Saxon allies. Those few central principalities that contrived to maintain their independence were chiefly mocked up by Prussia after the War of Brothers in 1866. France was still straining at the leash. Louis Napoleon's claims to the left bank proved his undoing when he lost the Battle of Sedan in 1870. Germany was united in a flush of national pride following a Prussian-led victory. It didn't last. The thin-skinned Prussian and German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck wanted to assert the authority of the new German emperor over the reactionary Pope Pius IX. A third of the inhabitants of the new Reich were Catholic, and many lived in the Rhineland. Bismarck banned the Jesuits and imposed anti-clerical laws, autocratic measures that left a bitter feeling. Wagner's tetralogy was an intoxicating brew in the new Germany. The Ring was part based in the medieval Nibelungenlied. Siegfried from Xanten in the Lower Rhine helps the Burgundian King Gunther in Worms to acquire the Princess Brunhilde, from Isel in the Low Countries. In Wagner's libretto, the river was the stage on which the entire drama was fought out. After 1871, the former revolutionary Wagner became a triumphant nationalist. The Rhine was also nationalized. It was Germany's river, not Germany's border, according to Arndt, and the left bank had to be defended against the incursions of the duplicitous French. United Germany's new combative stance was reflected in monuments created after 1871. From the steep slopes above Rüdesheim, a stonied Germania looked down, waving a finger at French colonial ambitions. It is a controversial monument now, inscribed with the nationalist verses of Die Wacht am Rhein. In Koblenz, the equestrian statue of the first Hohenzollern emperor, William, was removed after 1945. It has recently been resurrected. Alsace was reclaimed in 1871, along with parts of German-speaking Lorraine. The Rhine Valley was becoming more manageable through the laying of new railway lines along its banks. The region had developed two new vocations in the 19th century, industry and tourism. In the first instance, the Rhine benefited from the structural improvements made by Tuller and other engineers. Tuller worked for the Grand Duke of Baden and therefore deepened and widened the stretch of the Rhine from Basel to Karlsruhe. Others laboured on the portion between Karlsruhe and Mainz. In the Middle Rhine, there were more boulders and rapids. It is ironic that the Lorelei rock made so famous by Heine, which was meant to lure fishermen to their deaths, became a tourist attraction at the precise moment when it ceased to be a hazard to navigation. The river exerted a strong pull on the Romantics. The first painter to popularize the Rhine, let me see, was from my cabin window, with the engravings taken from his the first painter to popularize the Rhine with engravings taken from his pictures was the Cockney J.M.W. Turner. Here is my attempt to recreate something of a Turner's sky. Schumann's Rhenish Symphony proved fateful to his author, who attempted to commit suicide by throwing himself off a bridge in Düsseldorf. He died in an asylum in Beethoven's birthplace, Bonn. Steamship companies like Thomas Cook specialized in the Rhine. The Grand Tour was about to become the package tour. The first English steamship entered the Rhine in 1788. In 1816, an English boat cut the journey time from Rotterdam to Cologne from 6 weeks to 4 days. When the river became navigable to its full extent, Rhine cruises became popular. Those indispensable vade-mecums for elegant travellers, the Baedeker guides, were first published in Koblenz. Some tours took in Heidelberg, or passengers could disembark to connect to trains and visit Bavaria with its monasteries and castles, or the decennial passion play at Oberammergau. Wagner was to prove the biggest attraction of all when he created the Rhine's very own mermaids in the form of Rhine maidens. Tourists learned to enjoy the many spa towns and appreciate the sedate beauty of Bonn or Traben-Trarbach. At the gates of the Rheingau, Wiesbaden was the favoured spa of the Rhine Valley. In the beginning, there was little more than the Hesse-Nassau Palace at Biebrich, and it remained small until the second quarter of the 19th century. Goethe and various crowned heads changed all that when they became fans. But it was the last Kaiser's patronage that caused the development of the town, with its Biedermeier avenues and sumptuous villas snaking all the way up to the narrow Berg Hill, topped by its famous urban vineyard. The Low Countries grew fat on shipping finished cloth across the North Sea to the ports of the Hanseatic League. Mainz, at the confluence of the Rhine and the Main, was the traditional capital of the Rhine wine trade. The Cistercians brought Pinot grapes from Burgundy to the Rhine Valley in the 12th century, and Riesling grapes were first recorded at Rüsselheim near Mainz in the 15th. The Rhine was also a source for the wine drunk in Britain in the 16th century onwards. Rhenish wine was becoming increasingly refined, but it was not until the 18th century that wines called Kabinett were made and stored in a special cupboard at the Cistercian Kloster Eberbach. Half a century later, the first late-picked Spätlesen were accidentally produced at Schloss Johannisberg. Goethe set out to understand the geology of wine in the journey to the Rheingau and the Nahe, and composed his best Bacchic poetry in Wiesbaden in the Ostwestliche Divan. The 19th century was the golden age of Hock and Mosel, when any halfway good British cellar was proud to offer the best growths of Bernkastel, Brauneberg, Brüdesheim, and Hochheim. After 1871, Alsace became Germany's most productive wine region, but even when Alsace was French, there was no question of shipping the wine over the Vosges, and the natural destination for it was the north. During the Third Reich, resourceful Jewish wine merchants living in exile in Britain passed off Alsatian wine as German Hock and Mosel, beloved of the British bourgeoisie, until wine imports from the continent were stopped by war. Queen Victoria was also a fan of good Hock, and she has left her own monument on the Königen Victoriaberg in Hochheim, which gives us the word Hock. Her grandson, Kaiser William II, spent his student days sculling in the Middle Rhine in Bonn. As emperor, he rebuilt the Königsburg castle in Celesta in Alsace. He spent 2 weeks every year at the Wiesbaden Theatre Festival with his favorite sycophantic playwright, Joseph von Lauf. He was not the first Prussian prince to enjoy the Rhine. His great-uncle Frederick William IV had been inspired by the castles and initiated the project to finish Cologne Cathedral. In November 1918, Germany lost the First World War, and France reclaimed Alsace-Lorraine. In 1918, Alsatians who opted for Germany were allowed to take one small suitcase with them as they crossed the Rhine to their new homes. In 1940, Alsace became German again. Alsatians were encouraged to be patriotic, which might have contributed to the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, perpetrated by Alsatian members of the SS. After 1945, Alsatians were in the doghouse once more, forgive that pun, and there was a distinct shift to speaking French rather than Alemannic. In 1945, 77% of Alsatians spoke Alsatian. A decade ago, it was only 11% could manage it. French poilus were stationed in Mainz on the left bank in 1918. After their brutal occupation of the Ruhr, they departed in 1930, returning from 1945 to 1990, when they kept troops in the Rhineland and Baden. Even today, they maintain small military garrisons in Trier and Mülheim in the Black Forest. In 1918, the Allies maintained a bridgehead 30 kilometers deep into Germany. The British had their headquarters in Cologne, the Americans in Koblenz, and the Belgians in Aachen. The French seized German wine stocks and imposed Alsatian wines on the Germans at zero tariffs. In 1923, together with the Belgians, they occupied the Ruhr, where they met with stubborn resistance. They made an example of the saboteur Albert Schlageter and had him shot. 10 years later, the Nazis commemorated Schlageter with a day in their calendar, and numerous effigies were set up to him. The British administration in Cologne was gentle by comparison. During the days of inflation and hyperinflation, British squaddies lived like kings. They have left their houses they built for their officers, who naturally possessed their own club, known as the Earwig. The Americans departed in 1920 when the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans had to provide 25,000 tons of coal a day in reparations. Larger businesses were seized throughout the Rhineland, and many Rhinelanders fled to the unoccupied right bank. The French encouraged separatism, resulting in a movement and a political party. Support slackened off by the end of 1923. That year of political violence came to an end after the Dawes Plan restored the German economy. After the British garrison was wound up at Cologne, they briefly maintained a base at Wiesbaden, abandoning it in 1926. From 1925, Rhinelanders lived in comparative prosperity until they were struck low again by the Wall Street crash. Unemployment rose to over 6 million, enhancing the popularity of the Nazi Party. Hitler was appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933 after a month of subterfuge following a meeting with the banker Schröder in Cologne. The Nazis were keen to give every major German town and city some mark of favour. For Düsseldorf, it was Music Week and a chance to mock atonal composition and vilify jazz. During the war, the city was the home to the Edelweiss, pirates, and swing Jugend, primitive rebels addicted to jazz who attacked members of the Hitler Youth. Many were hanged. The Rhineland had its Nazis, but it was far from being the bedrock of the movement. No proper concentration of camps were planted in the region. The nearest was Natzweiler in Alsace, which opened in 1941. Goebbels from Reit, München-Gladbach, and Robert Lai from Cologne were both Catholic Rhinelanders, but their devotion to Nazism took precedence. Hitler launched his own Kulturkampf between 1935 and 1937, when Catholic monks were tried and imprisoned for perverting youth. Goebbels and Hitler wanted to wrest education from the church. This did little to endear the local people to the Nazis. The Catholic bishops mounted their own response to the Third Reich, of which the strongest was that of Count Garlin in Münster. The Palatinate had a charismatic local Nazi chief in Josef Bürkel, who rose to prominence on the back of the 1935 Saar plebiscite, which returned the province to Germany after 14 years in French custody. In vineyard areas, the Nazis pandered to the prejudices of simple peasants and promoted cooperative sellers to spite Jewish middlemen. The local wine trade was purged of Jews, many of whom quit the country. In the wine-producing areas, Nazi measures were relatively positive. They aimed at promoting purity and limiting planting to hillsides. Vineyards were rationalized by Flurbereinigung, which is something you will see in vineyards in Germany even now, where they try to rationalize the holdings in a particular area. And communications were brought up to date by building motorways, beginning with the stretch from Frankfurt to Darmstadt. Bürkel created the first German wine road, thereby instigating wine tourism. In Alsace, they removed the hybrid grapes from the vineyards and replaced them with Riesling, Gewürztraminer, and Pinot Blanc. The Nazis remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. 2 years later, Hitler and Chamberlain met at Bad Godesberg near Bonn. Hitler stayed at the Hotel Dresden. The Hotel Dresden, where the owner was a party member and a friend. Chamberlain lodged on the Petersberg across the water in Königswinter. Boats plied the Rhine between the two at night in an attempt to reach a settlement that would maintain peace in our time. I took this photograph in Bonn. It seems that the Dresdens own a cafe there. They still own the hotel, the famous hotel, the friend of Hitler's hotel. And it's a family hotel. When I tried to get a picture for my book on 1938 from them, they could see me coming a mile off. They were not offering any promotional pictures. But this little shot shows that they're still immortalized in the streets of Bonn. It's the same street where Beethoven's house is. Being lukewarm about Nazism did not protect the region from Allied retribution. The first bombs to hit the German mainland fell on Mönchengladbach, although that may have been calculated to upset Goebbels. The Germans themselves bombed Freiburg in the Black Forest, albeit by mistake. But if the Germans had made Rotterdam rich, it was also the Germans who destroyed the city. In May 1940, the city and port was leveled by the most thorough act of blitzkrieg carried out in the course of the Second World War. Once the Western Allies dominated the skies, there was no mercy. The Rhine was not only close to Britain, but the reflection of aircraft lights in the river made it easy to navigate. One by one, towns and cities were reduced to dust. With the exception of Switzerland, where Schaffhausen and Stein am Rhein were bombed by mistake, the Rhine Valley was devastated in the Second World War. The German industry in the Ruhr was understandably hit, and other industrial areas were natural targets. Ludwigshafen was badly bombed, for example, but as was Mannheim on the right bank opposite. But in Mannheim, the bombing destroyed most of the Baroque palace, as well as the wharves and factories. Cologne was subjected to one of the heaviest bombardments of the Second World War. In the 1,000-bomber raid, the city was almost completely obliterated. It was bombed 250 times. The treatment of Mainz was not much better, and in Little Pforzheim in the Black Forest, the RAF created a firestorm that wiped out a third of a 60,000-strong population in 22 minutes. It was the highest ratio of human destruction in any theatre of the Second World War. The great churches of the Rhine Valley have somehow contrived to survive the religious wars of the 16th century, the 30 Years' War, Louis XIV, the French Revolutionary Wars, Napoleon, and the bombing of the Second World War, followed by the Anglo-American advance. No town or city came through the Second World War unscathed. The British and Americans actually intentionally hit cultural sites such as Cologne. I'm going to go back and see, when I first went to Cologne doing my O-levels, age 15, and staying with the Burl family, they had not even started rebuilding the town hall, which is there, and that's how it looks now. So they're just about finished. And they intentionally hit cultural sites such as Cologne. Missions were flown to destroy unlikely monuments, such as the village of Aspannshausen in the Rheingau, and the old monastery at Schloss Johannisberg, property of Prince Metternich and about the most famous wine estate in Germany. What was saved from bombs was often wrecked in the course of the Allied advance. Halted on the Rhine, the opposing armies had time to launch endless salvos of shells at one another. The towns and cities on the river hardly stood a chance. A strong wind spared Wiesbaden from destruction. The Americans' designated post-war headquarters at Kassel did not fare so well. It was subjected to a British firestorm. The Americans moved to Wiesbaden instead, and that is Basel on the Rhine, and you can see the old railway line and the state it was left at the end of the war. The Americans reached Aachen in October 1944, but it was to take 6 months before they arrived at the ruins of Cologne. The next step was to establish a bridgehead on the right bank of the Rhine. They finally got their chance at Remagen, where the garrisons responsible failed to blow up the bridge, thereby allowing a sizable force to cross before German aircraft was able to bring it down. It's the 7th of March today, which is the anniversary of the American capture of the bridge at Remagen. Hitler had those responsible shot. The Americans were now free to penetrate the Ruhr. Despite an acute shortage of materiel, the Germans fought like lions to prevent the Allies from crossing the Rhine. But on the 21st of April 1945, the German Field Marshal Walter Model disbanded Army Group B, told his soldiers to go home and shot himself. There was now nothing to prevent the Western advance from joining up with the Russians on the Elbe. An earlier British campaign had seized the bridge over the River Waal at Nijmegen in the Low Countries, and the British and Poles had attempted to cross the Rhine at Arnhem by landing gliders and dropping parachutists. But the Germans successfully repelled their advance. This was the famous bridge too far. The French exacted a terrible revenge on the women of Freudenstadt as they advanced through the Black Forest. Both Garland and Archbishop Frings of Cologne gave the Allies a begrudging reception after 1945. After May 1945, the Rhineland was divided up between the British and the French. The latter's portion, with its twin bumps in Baden and Rhineland-Palatinate, was known as the Brassiere. From the Middle Rhine onwards, the river was British territory, Bonn, Cologne and Düsseldorf. The French had the vines, the British the ruins. 19 notorious Rhine meadow camps were used as pens for German POWs during the Allied advance. Administered by the US Army, the prisoners lived outside in one of the coldest springs in living memory. They died in droves. Local farmers relate that they regularly unearthed human remains when ploughing. American-occupied Wiesbaden centered on the Kurhaus and the palatial villas behind, which were fenced off and made out of bounds to Germans. American officers had the exclusive use of the Kurhaus to establish an American jazz bar. The occupying armies now had the job of getting Germany working again so it could feed itself, a big change from the previous Allied war aims. The British dismissed Konrad Adenauer as mayor of Cologne because they said he had failed to remedy the obvious sanitary problems. The destroyers were now cast as saviours. The Allies wanted the defeated Germans to like them. The vital factories were reopened, including Volkswagen, Hitler's people's car, which became the wheels of the occupation in the British zone. Adenauer, who had been mayor of Cologne since 1917, he was elected the first Chancellor of Germany in 1949 by one vote, his own. He put his trust in the French and de Gaulle. The post-war division of Germany allowed him to revive the Europe of Charlemagne and the Franks that had stretched beyond the Rhine's Saar tributary and embraced northern France as well as western Germany. Germany began to improve even before Adenauer took over. The man who masterminded this was Ludwig Erhard, working in the American zone. Germany's Basic Law, or Grundgesetz, was introduced on the day the Federal Republic was created, the 23rd of May 1949. Adenauer not only wanted the state to look west, he wanted to join NATO, and that meant making peace with the old soldiers. To this end, many Nazis were let off the hook, and Germany rapidly emptied its prisons of those awarded long sentences at Nuremberg and elsewhere. In 1957, Adenauer also seized the moment to rehabilitate Germany through membership of the nascent common market. That year, the Treaty of Rome brought together the Rhineland states of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, not to mention Belgium and Luxembourg. Only Italy lay beyond the immediate influence of the Rhine. In 1959, Bad Godesberg, the SPD, or Socialist Party, opted for normality, putting revolutionary change behind them. The left came into its own with the student uprising of 1968. Willy Brandt was translated for being a highly successful mayor of Berlin to German Chancellor. His successor was Helmut Schmidt, who had to deal with the terrorist menace of the Baader-Meinhof and Rote Armee Fraktion. The Bonn Republic was to last 40 years. Don't worry, I'm nearly there. The first 14 were dominated by Adenauer and the Cold War. It was an epoch brought to life by the Cologne-born novelist Heinrich Böll. From 1984 to 2000, the filmmaker Edgar Wright made his own attempt to record the history of the region in his multi-part series Heimat. Heimat took an imaginary village in the Hunsrück above the Mosel Valley in the years from 1919 to 2000 and charted the history of the leading families there, marking which were of the right by nature and which were of the left. It was a bold attempt to answer the untold number of questions about the history of the Rhineland in particular and Germany in general. Other West German chancellors, such as Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, were not rooted in the Rhineland, but with Helmut Kohl, the job went to a man from Ludwigshafen in the Palatinate. Kohl had a gift for making friends, although he failed badly with Mrs. Thatcher. With Kohl as Chancellor, Ronald Reagan as US President, and Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Germany moved closer and closer to reunification. First, there was the Helmut and Ronnie show at the SS cemetery at Bitburg, before Reagan went on to Berlin and told the SED to tear down this wall. Then there was Kohl's friendship with François Mitterrand. Kohl was wedded to his origins, to the degree that foreign notables were routinely entertained at his favourite inn, the Deidesheimer Hof in Deidesheim, which specialised in the earthy foods of the region. Heads of state and government were encouraged to eat Saumagen, a stuffed pig's belly. Only Mrs. Thatcher is known to have refused. 3 months after reunification, on the 22nd of June 1990, Kohl and Mitterrand met at Kaub, the place where Blücher crossed the Rhine to defeat Napoleon. Later that day, they had dinner at the Kroner in Assmannshausen. Kohl nonetheless wound up the Bonn Republic. On the 20th of June 1991, a vote in the Bundestag decided that the government would return to Berlin. The West German state was created with the Rhineland at its heart. Germany's opportunity to reintegrate the Rhine within the European trading and cultural infrastructure came with the Treaty of Paris in 1951, which established the principle of sharing resources in war-shattered continental Europe. This was the first step towards the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. The Rhine would benefit from this supranational community once again, even if Switzerland held aloof. Since then, the Rhine has ceased to be merely a Swiss, German, French, or Dutch waterway. It has become Europe's river. Despite the role the Rhine plays in half a dozen countries, it is still perceived as Germany's river too. Kohl was no exception. In one of the more poignant moments of his negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev, Kohl took the Soviet leader down to the Rhine, where it lapped at the Chancellor's bungalow in Bonn. "Look at this river," he said. "The Rhine flows into the sea. You can dam the Rhine, but then it will find another route and pursue it with all its might. And so it will be with German unity." Thank you. Only 5 minutes over. Questions?
Thank you very, very much for a really fascinating and erudite talk. It makes the Thames seem very boring. So maybe you'll answer a few questions.
I'm delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you.
I've just put up a nice view of the Rheingau, so you can think of the glass of wine that you might have later.
Judy.
Do you by any chance have a map of the Rhine?
Not on this, not here, no. I should have put it on, shouldn't I?
Thank you.
I had described it, but obviously it wasn't appropriately visible. Yes.
Excuse me, you don't really need it.
Do I?
One.
I take it that you have actually travelled right from the start.
I've never been up to Lake Toma.
Oh, is that
So
for another book?
Only from Lake Constance.
Thanks very much indeed. It was a lovely survey all up and down the Rhine. I have been to Lake Toma. It's very, very difficult to have access to get sort of to the far end. But I didn't get to the very source, but I stood on the other side of the lake and saw where it really came from, which was the other side with a couple of little houses. But it is an absolutely fascinating river. I wondered if I could add two tiny details, which you put so much into it that when you mentioned them, I thought you might say them, then you didn't. One was when the Russians came to the Rhine and crossed it in 18, what are we? I can't remember what, 4, 14, I suppose, no, a bit later than that, 14 probably. Yeah. And the Rhine actually froze over. They got over it because there wasn't a bridge.
Almost as low as it was recently, wasn't it? You could cross there at Cowes,
And there are stories still spoken on the German side, where they remember, so far back, the Russians pillaged wood from everywhere. Doorways, doors, window frames, everything was taken out to lay across the ice to help get their wagons across as well. And they did it all over on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve, I can't remember, very, very late in the year. And that was obviously a dramatic military manoeuvre.
And I can see that point because it's just where, from the Rheingau, which you see there, is just the moment when the Rhine turns the corner at Cowes. So that's where the Russians would have crossed.
And the other lovely instance, you stated it, the difficulty of persuading Mrs. Thatcher that Helmut Kohl was a representative figure or someone she should take seriously. He took her or on one meeting, I don't know if there were other meetings as well, but they met in Speyer on one occasion, and notoriously didn't get on, and he was telling her, come to the heart of Germany in this magnificent cathedral, wonderful rebuilding around it and so forth. And it really wasn't registering with her at all. It wasn't her scene at all. And he realized he had to cut this. So he said, no, but I beg your pardon, she said, I'm terribly sorry, I've got to go to some other meeting. And he said, so have I. I mean, it wasn't quite as crude as that. But they split earlier than they should have done, according to the protocol. But she had to kill time, and she killed time in the end by walking through the town, down a market street or whatever it was, and there was Cole stuffing on cream cakes with his small entourage, complaining about the British.
I hadn't realised that would take place
wonderful.
in Speyer, but I did know the story.
Oh, over here. Okay. Oh, sorry. We go around the houses, sorry. Okay. Hello. This is you were moving at breakneck speed through a lot of material I didn't know about, so I didn't gather everything, but I wanted to just ask a question based on something that was inside there. So part of my life experience was living with, father had been in London Blitz, mother in Coventry Blitz, and granddad who lived with us in the trenches throughout the First World War. So cut to, incredible inclusion, and my father's orchestra being twinned with Germany and so on, and German pen pals coming over. But when I was then working as a dancer, I did then, but I'm very loud. I was in Berlin, and my aunt, whose husband had been a bomber in the war, actually, came out, and we went around Berlin, and I said, all the trees are new. There are no old trees in this city. And she said, Catherine, don't you know that it was raised in the war? And I had been brought up on, obviously, 50s B movies, 40s and 50s B movies, where only where the Germans were always the baddies. And it had an unconscious prejudice. And something that you were saying, which was interesting, it's happening now, was interesting to me is, because Germany wasn't occupied in World War I, and obviously France was occupied and devastated, 1 million French died before we got there, as I'm sure you know. One of the things I kind of wonder about was Germany was able to farm after the First World War and to still be producing food and so on and so forth, whereas parts of France were utterly devastated. Then, with Hitler coming in and, as you say, becoming Chancellor in, I think, 1933, and unemployment, I just wondered what your feelings are about the sort of schoolgirl experience of hearing about unemployment devastation in Germany after World War I, because I'm interested by the appalling thing. It's the first time I've heard about the treatment of the Germans under the Americans.
Well, one important point is that, not for the first time, the British imposed a naval blockade almost from the beginning of the First World War. Now, naval blockades take a long time to work, but they do work. And by 1916, the Germans were starving. And then you had sort of strange throwback to contemporary events, the famous turnip winter in 1917, where, the figures are fought over, but up to 800,000 people died as a result of malnutrition. So no, they carried on. They did not carry on, and there was a ridiculous moment where they slaughtered all the pigs because they said that they were unnecessary eaters, and then they had nothing to eat, and there was just bad pig management, if you like. But no, Germany went through the First World War with great difficulty because of a planned starvation of Germany, which was to replicate the continental blockade during the Napoleonic Wars. So that time meant that you did have a lot of civil unrest in Germany because, you know, when mothers saw their children starving and people working in factories and that sort of thing started getting angry, particularly people, you know, the workers were unhappy with what was happening. So that it did produce, and there was a lot of dismissal of the famous stab in the back that Hitler talked about after the First World War. There was an element of the stab in the back because there were massive strikes in vital industries. And then, of course, as soon as Germany announced that it more or less lost the war and sued for an armistice, there was a revolution and an uprising, and Germany was taken over essentially from the left. So Germany didn't have an easy time in the First World War. I mean, I think that's the essential point there. They had to eat turnips. There were no tomatoes. Monroe.
I think quick question, if I may. Yes, which is you talked about in the 20s this fascinating moment when France encourages the Rhineland to become independent. I mean, to what extent was that ever a serious proposition? Was it just
I think there was a certain amount of money pumped into it, into sort of bribing the necessary figures and that sort of thing. Remember 1923, which produced, of course, the Munich Putsch and all sorts of things, was a year of uprisings and revolutions and that sort of thing. And I think if France could finally satisfy these old ambitions of taking over the left bank and that sort of thing, they would have been very happy indeed. So it's ironic that later, that what makes the foundation of European cooperation post-Second World War was essentially the bond between Adenauer and de Gaulle. And that produced the marriage which essentially drew in the other elements that were to make the Treaty of Rome. So it was only then, as the point I make there, that after the Second World War, that the French finally put away their desire to make off with the left bank of the Rhine.
Giles, thank you very much. I think we'll have to call a halt now, but we'll be in the members' room, and you can go on talking there. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Giles, would you like to keep this?
Well, I might keep it. I don't have it printed out. I only have it,